The last week of January in 1932, up a frozen holler above Wallens Creek, Della Sargent had 9 mouths to feed and $2.40 to do it with. Not for a day, for a week. What she pulled from that dirt cellar floor, that smokehouse, and that iron pot, there is a week of her life I want to walk you through. By the end of it, you will recognize her pantry. You might even recognize her. 2 rooms. That was the whole house. A stoveroom and a sleeping room, and a loft over the sleeping room where the older boys slept under quilts, stuffed with wool that had been carded by hand. There was no icebox. There was no cellar you would recognize as a basement, with a furnace humming in the corner and a dehumidifier running on a timer. There was a hole dug into the bank behind the cabin, faced with creek stone laid up dry, with a door of planks and a step down into the dark. There was a smokehouse the size of an outhouse, standing off from the cabin so it would not take the house with it if it caught. And out past the fence, half up the slope, there was an apple tree that a woman had planted before the Civil War, and it was still setting fruit in 1931. $2.40 at the store that week. That was salt and soda and a twist of coffee and a little sugar. Everything else came out of a system that was already sitting on that hillside before the 1st of January. That is the part I want you to hear, not the recipes, the system. Because I can tell you how to make a pot of soup beans, and so can anybody. What almost nobody will tell you anymore is how a house is arranged so that a pot of soup beans is possible in the last week of January, when the road is iced shut and there is no money and no truck coming. Della Sargent did not have a pantry the way you have a pantry, which is a cabinet full of things you bought. She had a pantry the way a barn has hay, which is to say the pantry was a place in a building, and the building itself was doing work. The cabin was the appliance. I want you to sit with this. My name is Rachel Glick. My husband is Amos. We farm in Holmes County, Ohio, and I keep the cellar and the kitchen and the jar shelf on this place, which means I am the one who finds out in February whether the work in September was done right. My nephew runs the camera and puts these talks up for us. Our bishop permits it for teaching, and I hold to that. I am not going to sell you a fantasy about how easy the old ways were. They were not easy, but they worked, and they worked without a plug. And I can show you exactly how, because most of it is still standing behind my own house. Before we go on, one thing. The stores in this country hold about 3 days of food for the people who depend on them. 3 days. Your great-grandmother's house held a winter, and the difference was never money. It was knowing. That knowing is written down in a book we keep at amosglick.com, and I will tell you plain, there is a paper copy, printed and bound and mailed to your door, because I know a good many of you have been burned trying to open a file on a machine you did not want in the first place. That is the only place it lives. If you see somebody in the comments pushing a miracle book I never named, that is not me, and it is not a friend of mine. All right, back to it. Now here is the twist, and it is the thing that took me years to understand about Della Sargent's week. She was not economizing. There is a picture in most people's heads of depression cooking as making do, stretching, going without. That is not what a mountain pantry was. That was a woman drawing down a stored surplus that she had built on purpose, in a fixed order, according to what would go bad first. Nothing in that cellar was there by accident. Every crock and every crate and every hanging thing had a place chosen for it, and the place was chosen by temperature and by moisture and by how fast that food was fixing to die. That is not poverty. That is engineering. And the reason it looks like poverty to us is that somewhere along the way we stopped being taught the engineering and were left with only the pictures. So here is how I am going to do this. I am going to show you 3 tiers, because a holler was not one kind of household. There was the poorest place on the creek, the family that had no hog and no smokehouse. There was the middling place, which is what Della had. And then there is you, in 2026, with a truck and a hardware store, and probably a refrigerator that costs you money every month, whether it has anything in it or not. What the poorest did, what the middling did, what you can do this week. And I'm going to walk you through her 7 days meal by meal, and I am going to do the honest arithmetic on it at the end, because I do not want you taking my word for whether 9 people were actually fed. Let me start with why the hole in the ground works. Because if you understand this one thing, everything else in this talk falls into place. And if you do not, you will do what a great many well-meaning folks do, which is carry a bushel of good potatoes down into a modern basement in October and carry a bucket of sprouted mush back up in January and decide the old ways were a myth. Dig down. About 4 feet under the surface of the ground, in most of the country, the daily swing of the weather stops mattering. Get to 6 or 8 feet, and the yearly swing mostly stops mattering too. The dirt is a slow, heavy blanket, and it holds close to the average yearly temperature of wherever you are standing. In eastern Tennessee, in Ohio, and Kentucky, that average runs somewhere in the low 50s in the deep ground. But a cellar dug into a north-facing bank, with a vent to draw the January air through it at night, and a door shut against the afternoon, will settle in through the winter, between about 34 and 40 degrees. Cold enough to hold. Not cold enough to freeze the water inside a potato and burst its cells. The engineers call it thermal mass and ground coupling. The old folks just said the ground keeps its own weather. Same thing. Now the second half, and this is the half everybody misses. Cold is only one of the 2 numbers. The other is moisture, and moisture is what actually separates a dirt cellar from your basement. A cellar with a dirt floor sits at something like 85 to 95% humidity. That is nearly wet. You can feel it on your face when you go down the steps, and a carrot buried in damp sand down there in November will come out in March, still snapping when you break it, because a carrot is mostly water, and the only thing it fears more than freezing is drying out. A modern basement, with a poured concrete floor sealed against the ground, a furnace pulling air through it, and very often a dehumidifier running on purpose, sits at 35 to 50%. That is desert air. Put a bushel of carrots in that, and in 6 weeks you have a bushel of orange leather. So hear me plainly, because this is the sentence I most want you to keep. A modern basement does not fail to preserve produce because it is too warm. It fails because it is too dry, and because it is too steady. Your furnace room does not breathe with the season. The bank behind Della's cabin did. That is the mechanism. The cabin, the bank, the stone, the vent, and the door were the appliance. She did not run it. She only opened and shut it. Now let me give you the room-by-room map, because this is the part I have never once seen written down whole, and it is the actual pantry. There were 4 storage climates on that place, and every one of them held different food. Not because of tradition, because of physics. The first climate is the dirt cellar. Cold and damp. 34 to 40 degrees, 90% moisture, dark. Into it went every root and every crop that is mostly water and wants to stay that way. Potatoes went in slatted crates or in a bin, up off the floor a few inches on stones or scrapboard, so air moved under them, and they went in dark, because light on a potato makes it turn green, and green on a potato is solanine, and it will make you sick. Carrots and beets and turnips and parsnips went into a box of damp sand or damp sawdust, layered so they did not touch, roots down, tops cut to about a ½ inch. Cabbage went in with the roots still on, either hung head down from a joist or set in a bin of damp sand, and cabbage will hold you into February, but it will also perfume the whole cellar, so it lived at the far end, away from anything that takes up smell. Apples went in wooden crates, wrapped one at a time in newspaper if the family had newspaper. And here is the thing about apples. They breathe out a gas as they ripen, and that gas will sprout your potatoes and turn your carrots bitter. So apples lived at the far end from the potatoes, or better, in their own bin by the door. If you take nothing else from the map, take that one. Apples and potatoes are not friends. Second climate, the smokehouse. Cool, dry, dark, and airy. Hams and shoulders and sides hung from the rafters wrapped in muslin or in a cloth sack, or packed in a wooden box in the salt they were cured in. That building wanted to breathe. It wanted moving air more than it wanted cold. A cured ham hanging in the dark with a draft on it will last a family through summer. Take that same ham and hang it in the damp of the root cellar, and you will grow a fur coat on it in a month. Third climate, behind the stove and above it, warm and dry, and running maybe 70 to 85 degrees any time the fire was going. This is where the things that hate damp lived. Sacks of dry beans in a lidded crock or a flour tin, cornmeal in a covered tin, dried apple slices strung on thread, onions and garlic braided and hung near the chimney corner, seed corn on the ear, hanging in a sack from a nail high on the wall. Every one of those things spoils by taking on moisture, so every one of them lived in the driest part of the building. Sweet potatoes are the odd one out, and I want to name it, because folks kill their sweet potatoes every year, putting them in the cellar with the Irish potatoes. Sweet potatoes want 55 to 60 degrees and moderate air. Cellar cold ruins them. They belong in the warm room, in a basket, not the cold hole. Fourth climate. The cold north room, or the north end of the loft, or the unheated back porch closet, 30 to 45 degrees, dry, and it swung with the weather. This is where crocks of things already preserved sat waiting. The kraut crock after the ferment had finished, milk and butter in cold weather, a pan of mush poured out to set overnight. The lard crocks, salt pork in its brine. Anything that had already been made safe by salt or acid or fat did not need the humidity of the cellar, and it did better in the cold dry. That is the whole pantry. 4 climates, 1 building, and a hole in the bank. If somebody had asked Della Sargent to explain that to them, she would have looked at them like they had asked her to explain why you put the horse in the barn. She did not have theory. She had a house that had taught 80 years of women where things go. Now the tears. Because this is where the honest part of the history lives. The poorest household on that creek had no hog. That is the dividing line in the mountain south more than anything else. No hog means no smokehouse worth the name, no lard for the year, no side meat to season a pot. That family ate beans and cornbread and greens and potatoes, and the fat came from whatever they could beg, trade, or shoot, and mostly the fat was thin. They had the cellar, because a cellar is dug with a mattock and costs nothing but a man's back. They had the greens, because a hillside is free. What they did not have was calories that came concentrated, and that is why the poorest children in those hollers were the small ones. Nobody starved on beans and cornmeal. But a boy who works and grows on beans and cornmeal alone will not be as big as his cousin whose father killed a hog. That is the truth, and it does not get told enough. The middling household is Dela. 1 hog, killed in November. A cow, sometimes dry through the deep of winter. A dozen hens, who mostly quit laying by December and picked back up in late February. The apple tree. A cellar with 100 bushel in it in November, and maybe 25 left by March. $2.40 of store goods a week for salt and soda and coffee and a little sugar. That family ate every day, ate hot, and had a piece of meat in the pot most days, even if the piece of meat was the size of your thumb. And then there is your household. And I want to be fair to you. You very likely have no bank to dig into. You may be in a second-floor apartment. You may be in a trailer where there is not 1 square foot below 70 degrees in July. I will get to you specifically, I promise, and I will get to you with actual numbers and actual containers, not with a wish. Let me tell you about the apple tree first, because it is the single most misunderstood thing in this whole story. A tree planted before the Civil War and still bearing in 1931 is not a miracle. It is a variety choice. In the old orchards, there were 2 entirely different kinds of apples, and the folks who planted them knew the difference cold. There were eating apples and cooking apples, which are sweet and tender and ripen in August and September and are worth nothing to you by November. And then there were keepers. Winter apples. Varieties that come off the tree in late October, hard as a hickory nut and frankly not very good to eat, sour and tight, and then sit in a cellar and slowly become good. Some of them are not fit to eat until Christmas. Some of them will hold until March or April. Names you may still find are Arkansas Black, Winesap, Newtown Pippin, Roxbury Russet, Northern Spy, Ashmead's Kernel, Baldwin, and around here the old folks kept Rome Beauty for cooking and Winesap for eating out of hand in February. Why do they keep and the grocery apple does not? 3 reasons, and they are all mechanical. A keeper apple has a thick skin and often a rough, dull, russeted skin, which loses water slowly. A keeper apple is high in acid, and acid slows the breakdown of the flesh. And a keeper apple ripens late and slow, meaning it comes into the cellar with most of its ripening still ahead of it, so it has somewhere to go. A supermarket apple has been bred the exact opposite way. Thin skin so it shines, low acid so it tastes sweet the day you buy it, picked at full ripeness so it eats well on the shelf. It has nowhere left to go but down. It does keep, but only because somebody is running it through a controlled atmosphere warehouse where they pull the oxygen down to about 2% and hold it just above freezing, and the moment that apple leaves the warehouse, the clock starts again. So you can buy a 9-month-old apple in June. You just cannot buy an apple that will keep in your own house for 9 months without help. Those are 2 entirely different things, and the store has quietly swapped one for the other. If you want a keeper tree, and I hope you do, here is what to do. Look for a nursery that sells heritage or antique apple varieties on standard or semi-dwarf rootstock. Expect to pay somewhere between $42 and $65 for a bare root whipping stick of a tree in 2026. More, if prices keep running the way they have. Plant it bare root in the dormant season, late fall or early spring. You will want 2 different varieties within about 50 feet for pollination, because most apples will not set fruit on their own. And here is the part nobody says out loud. A semi-dwarf will give you a real crop in year 4 or 5. A standard tree may take 8. Dayla's tree was planted by a woman who knew she would be old before it paid her. That is what planting is. It is a letter to somebody you have not met. Now the corn, because corn is the other leg the whole week stands on, and there is a thing about cornmeal that will save you money and heartache if you know it. Corn went to the mill down the branch, and the miller took his toll, which in a good many mountain counties was a portion of the meal itself rather than cash, commonly around 1/8. That meal came home ground whole, germ and all, still faintly sweet, and it smelled like something. And here is the trouble with it. The germ of a corn kernel is where the oil is, and oil goes rancid. Stone-ground whole cornmeal at room temperature behind the stove will start to turn on you in about 6 weeks to 3 months, and in the summer it can turn in a month. It does not make you sick right away, it just goes bitter and tastes like old paint. And folks who try to go back to real cornmeal often quit because their first bag went off and they thought they had bought bad meal. Degerminated meal, which is what nearly everything in a paper sack at the grocery is, has had the germ and the oil taken out at the mill. That is why it sits on a shelf for a year and does not turn. It is also why it will not feed you the way whole meal does, and why it tastes like nothing. So the old rule, and it is a good rule, grind small and grind often. Della's family did not keep a year of cornmeal. They kept whole corn, on the ear or shelled in a bin, because whole dry corn will sit for years, and they carried a sack to the mill every few weeks. The storage was in the kernel, not in the meal. That is the whole trick, and it is exactly backwards from how we do it now. If you want whole stone-ground meal today, and you do not have a mill down the branch, buy it in 5-pound sacks and put it in the freezer. Whole meal in a sealed bag in the freezer will hold a year and better. In a cool cellar in a lidded tin, it will give you 4 to 6 months. Behind the stove, 6 weeks in summer, maybe 3 months in winter. Smell it before you use it. Fresh whole meal smells sweet and a little grassy. Turned meal smells sharp and oily and slightly like crayons. And once you have smelled it once, you will never miss it again. Expect to pay around $4 and change to $6 for a 2-pound bag of real stone ground meal in 2026, against maybe $1.70 for the degerminated sack. That gap is the whole story of what happened to American bread money. All right. The week. Last week of January, 1932. I have reconstructed this from what a household of that kind in that county at that season would actually have had in front of it. And I will tell you honestly where I am reasoning rather than reporting. Monday. Breakfast is fried mush cut from a loaf pan that was poured out Sunday night and set to firm in the cold north room, sliced a ½ inch thick and fried in grease until it crusts, with sorghum poured over. Dinner in the middle of the day, because dinner was at noon, is soup beans that went in the kettle at daybreak, with a knuckle of side meat and 1 onion out of the braid, and a pone of cornbread baked in the hot skillet. Supper is the same beans, with the pot liquor and cornbread crumbled in, and a dish of fried apples off the cellar crate. Tuesday. Breakfast is biscuits, if there is flour, and sawmill gravy made from the grease left in the skillet, with 2 spoons of flour, and milk poured slow. Dinner is beans again. Third day on the same pot, better every day. Supper is potatoes fried in grease with onion and a plate of kraut out of the crock in the north room. Wednesday. The bean pot is finished. Breakfast is mush again, because this fried is cheap, and it is hot, and it sticks. Dinner is a mess of turnips and turnip greens from the sandbox in the cellar, boiled with a piece of meat with the pot liquor kept. Supper is cornbread crumbled in sweet milk if the cow is giving, and if she is not, in the turnip liquor, and nobody at that table thought that was sad. Thursday. Breakfast is fried potatoes and a little side meat. Dinner is a stack of dried apple pies, or more likely 1 big dried apple stack cake if a birthday landed that week, and boiled potatoes. Supper is beans started fresh that morning, a second pot for the back half of the week. Friday. Breakfast is mush and sorghum. Dinner is beans and cornbread. Supper is cabbage, quartered out of the cellar bin, boiled with a scrap of pork and black pepper, with the last of the cornbread. Saturday. This is the day the hen house pays, if it pays at all. And in late January, in a mountain holler, the hens are barely laying, so the eggs on Saturday are just as likely to be eggs that were put down in a crock the previous May under a lime solution and are being drawn out now, in the lean part of the year, exactly on purpose. Eggs fried in grease, potatoes, cornbread. Dinner is soup made off the ham bone, which has been simmering on the back of the stove since Thursday, with potatoes and a handful of dried beans and whatever greens the girls could dig out from under the leaves on the south slope. Supper is what did not get ate at dinner. Sunday, the best day. A piece of the smoked shoulder cut down off the rafter and fried, apples fried in the pork grease until the sugars caramelized, biscuits, gravy, and the last of the sorghum. And after, if it was a good year, a dried apple pie. That is 9 people, 21 meals. And I want to do the arithmetic honestly, rather than let it sit there sounding romantic. 9 people, of whom say 2 are grown men doing hard physical work in cold weather, 2 are grown women doing hard physical work, and 5 are children of assorted sizes. A working man in the cold at that trade is burning somewhere around 3,500 to 4,500 calories a day. A woman running that house, hauling water, splitting kindling, doing wash by hand, is burning 2,400 to 3,000. Children. Call it 1,400 to 2,200 apiece, depending on age. Add that up, and the household needs somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 to 24,000 calories a day. Over 7 days, call it 160,000 calories for the week. Now, what does the pantry actually give? A pound of dry pinto beans is roughly 1,600 calories and about 100 grams of protein. A pound of cornmeal is roughly 1,650 calories. A pound of lard is right at 4,000 calories, and that is the number that matters most, because fat is the only cheap, concentrated energy a mountain family had. A pound of potatoes is around 350 calories. A pound of cured pork is anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000, depending on how fat it is. So a week at that house is roughly 10 to 12 pounds of beans, 12 to 15 pounds of cornmeal, 25 to 30 pounds of potatoes and roots, 3 to 4 pounds of lard and grease, 4 or 5 pounds of cured pork, a good pile of cabbage and kraut and greens, and apples. Run that out, and you land in the range of 150 to 170,000 calories, with somewhere near 1,000 to 1,100 grams of protein for the week, which across 9 people is right about at what they need and not one bit over. That is my honest math, and here is my honest caveat. It is tight. It works because of the lard. Take the hog out of that week, and the whole thing collapses into hunger. And that is precisely why the hog was the dividing line between the poorest household and the middling one. And the diet is thin on one thing in particular, which is vitamin C in the deep winter. And that is the actual reason the kraut crock and the winter apples were not a nicety. They were the medicine. Fermented cabbage keeps its vitamin C. Boiled cabbage loses a good deal of it. A holler that ate its kraut got through February. A holler that did not got sore gums by March. Nobody in 1932 could have told you the word ascorbic acid. They just knew you eat your kraut. The $2.40, by the way, that was not food mostly. That was salt, which she could not make, and soda, which she could not make, and coffee, and a little sugar, and maybe a spool of thread. Salt was the one purchase that the entire year of meat depended on, and that is worth sitting with. The single thing that mountain self-sufficiency could not do without was the one thing it had to buy. Now let me say the part you would expect me to skip. What this pantry does not do. It does not give you variety. 7 days on that table is beans, cornbread, potatoes, greens, apples, pork, and repeat. And if you set that in front of a modern family on a Tuesday, you would have a rebellion by Thursday. It does not give you fresh green food. From December to March. None, not one leaf, except what somebody dug out from under the leaf litter. It does not give you a safety margin. If the potatoes rotted, if the cellar flooded, if the hog got sick in October, the week I just described does not happen, and the family goes hungry, and plenty of families did, and it does not give you your time back. That table took 2 women working from before daylight until after dark, every single day, with no day off, and I will not stand here and pretend it did not. Now the safety word plainly, because 2 things in this talk can hurt you, and I am not going to be coy about it. Smoking and curing meat. Cold smoke does not cook anything. It flavors and it dries the surface, and the thing that actually makes a country ham safe is the salt, not the smoke. That means your cure ratio is not a matter of taste, it is a matter of whether your household gets sick. Do not guess and do not go by a story you heard. Get the current cure numbers from your state extension service, use the curing salt they name, weigh your meat and weigh your salt on a scale, and keep the meat in the temperature range they publish through the entire cure, generally in the 36 to 40 degree range. Warm meat with a slow cure on it is exactly how botulism gets a foothold, and botulism does not smell or taste like anything. The old men on that creek did not guess either. They measured with a scale that hung by the smokehouse door, and they cured in the cold weeks of November on purpose. If you cure meat at home, be as careful as they were. Cellar storage. Do not put a cellar under a place where fuel or chemicals or a car sits, and do not vent it into a garage. Keep light off potatoes, and cut away and throw out anything green. Do not store apples with roots. Go down and look every 10 days or so and take out anything soft, because one rotten apple genuinely does take the crate. And if you ever build a deep cellar with a tight door, understand that a closed pit can hold air that will not support you, especially if anything is fermenting in it. Prop the door and let it air a minute before you go down and stay down. That is a rare thing, but it is a real thing. And fermenting. Kraut is one of the safest things in a farm kitchen, and it is safe for exactly one reason. The salt and the brine keep out oxygen. The bacteria on the cabbage make acid, and the acid takes the pH down below where anything dangerous can live. So the rules are simple, and they are not optional. Salt by weight, about 2 to 2.25% of the weight of the cabbage, which is roughly 3 tablespoons of plain salt to 5 pounds of shredded cabbage. Use plain salt, not iodized. The brine must cover the cabbage completely, every day, all the way through. Weight it down. If it goes above the brine, it molds. And if it molds through you, throw it out. You do not scrape and hope. Fermented at 55 to 70 degrees. And the cooler end gives you better kraut in longer time, 3 to 6 weeks. When it is sour and clear, move it to the cold, where it will hold months. Smell is your instrument. Sour and clean is right. Rotten, slimy, or pink is wrong, and it goes to the hogs, or in your case, the trash. Now, some of you are going to ask about substitutions, so let me get ahead of you. Can you use sand for the root box if you have no sawdust? Yes. Play sand out of the hardware store, dampened until it holds a shape in your fist. Works better than sawdust for carrots. Can you use plastic totes instead of wooden crates? Yes, but drill holes, because roots have to breathe, and a sealed tote will sweat and rot the lot. Can you use a garage instead of a cellar? Only if the garage stays between 32 and 45 degrees all winter, and most attached garages do not. They swing 30 degrees in a day, and swings are worse than the wrong steady number. Can you use table salt for the kraut? You can, but the iodine can darken it, and anticaking agents make the brine cloudy, so buy the plain canning salt. It is about $2.40 for a box, which I did not plan and which I like very much. What you must not swap is the curing salt in a ham for regular salt. Regular salt will not stop the organism that regular salt was never meant to stop, and that one substitution can kill somebody at your table. Here is the failure I own, so you know I have earned the right to warn you. Our first winter in this house, I put up 11 bushels and I set the apple crates against the potato bin because it was tidy. By the 1st of February, the potatoes had sprouted eyes as long as my finger, and the carrots in the next box tasted bitter enough to spit out. Amos came down the steps, looked at the whole business, and did not say a word about it. He just moved the apple crates to the other end and went back up. Cost me most of 2 bins. Taught me the map I just gave you. You will botch one somewhere too, neighbor. That is not the end of the system. That is how a person learns it. Now, if you live small, I have not forgotten you. A great many of you write to me from apartments and trailers and town lots with no bank to dig into, and I am not going to hand you a root cellar you cannot have. Here is what actually works, in order of how little you need. A north-facing closet on an outside wall, in a room you do not heat. Open the closet door in the cold of the night. Shut it in the afternoon. Put a cheap thermometer in there, $4 to $9, and watch it for a week before you trust it. If it holds under 50, onions, garlic, winter squash, and keeper apples will live in there for months. That is the free option, and most of you have it. An unheated stairwell or an enclosed porch. Same idea, more swing. Good for kraut, crocks, and squash and onions. Not good for carrots, because it is dry. A buried tote, if you have any ground at all, even a garden bed. Take a heavy plastic tote around 20 gallons, drill a dozen 1/4-inch holes in the sides near the top, sink it in the ground so the lid sits just above grade, pack roots in damp sand inside it, put the lid on, and pile a foot of straw or leaves over the whole thing. and a board on top of that to shed rain. That will hold carrots, beets, and turnips through a hard winter, and the whole rig runs you about $14 to $22 for the tote and around $8 for a bag of play sand. That is a working root cellar for under $30, and it fits in a raised bed. A 5-gallon bucket sunk beside the back step, same principle, smaller, holds enough carrots for 2 people to eat all winter. And if you truly have nothing, no ground and no cold corner, then do what mountain people did when they had no cellar either, which is preserve rather than store. Dry it, ferment it, render it, salt it. A jar of kraut on a shelf and a bag of dried apples do not care what temperature your apartment is. Now let me tell you who profits, because you have been patient, and this is the part that puts a burr under my saddle. Nobody outlawed the dirt cellar. Nobody had to. Between roughly 1,945 and 1,965 in one single generation, 3 things happened to the American winter table. The mechanical refrigerator went from a rich person's appliance to a thing in every kitchen in the country. The interstate highway network went in, and with it the refrigerated truck, so that a head of lettuce cut in California could sit in an Ohio store in about 3 days. And the chain supermarket produce section opened its doors coast to coast with a cold case humming 24 hours a day, selling you July in January. In one lifetime, the job of feeding a family through the winter moved off the back of a woman with a mattock and a hillside and onto a truck that pulls up to a loading dock. And the woman was told, gently and constantly, and from every magazine on the rack, that the hole in the bank behind her house was primitive, and that the white box in her kitchen was progress. Here is the thing about that trade. The cellar was paid for once, in labor, with a mattock and some creek stone, and after that it ran on nothing forever. The cold chain is paid for every month, by you, in your electric bill, and in the price of every item that rode a refrigerated truck to reach you, and in the price of a warehouse in Washington State holding apples in low oxygen until June. You did not stop paying for cold storage. You just stopped owning it. I do not call that a conspiracy. It is worse than a conspiracy. Nobody had to sit down in a room and arrange it. There was simply a great deal of money in selling a family its winter, and there was no money at all in a hole in a bank, so the hole quietly stopped getting dug, and nobody noticed the year it stopped. And here is the small, mean detail that tells you the shape of the whole thing. Look at what happened to the apple. They did not take keeper varieties away from you by force. They just bred and shipped and shelved the kind that cannot keep in your house, and stopped selling you the kind that can. And now you have to buy an apple in February from the people who own the warehouse. Every trade has a version of that. The blade you cannot sharpen. The filter that only fits one machine. The seed that will not come true next year. It is always the same move, which is to take the part you could have owned and turn it into a bill. Now let me say the whole thing once more, slow, for the folks with a pencil, and then I will let you go. Dirt cellar, 34 to 40 degrees, 85 to 95% humidity, dark dirt floor or gravel, 1 vent, low, and 1 high. Modern basement, 35 to 50% humidity, too dry. That is why your produce dies, not the temperature. Roots in damp sand, tops cut to a 1/2 inch. Do not let them touch. Potatoes in the dark, up off the floor. Green means throw it away. Apples away from potatoes, always. Cabbage at the far end. Sweet potatoes are not cellar food. 55 to 60 degrees. Keep them warm. Beans and cornmeal and onions behind the stove, warm and dry. Cured meat in the smokehouse or a cool, airy, dark place, wrapped in cloth, never in the damp cellar. Kraut and lard and salt pork in the cold north room. Kraut, 2 to 2.25% salt by weight. About 3 tablespoons plain salt to 5 pounds. Shredded cabbage, brine over the top always, 55 to 70 degrees, for 3 to 6 weeks, then cold, then it holds months. Whole stone ground cornmeal, 6 weeks to 3 months warm, 4 to 6 months cool, a year in the freezer, and it smells sharp and oily when it is turned. Store the corn, not the meal. Keeper apple varieties: Arkansas Black, Winesap, Newtown, Pippin, Roxbury, Russet, Northern Spy. Baldwin, $42 to $65. A bare root tree in 2026, 2 varieties within 50 feet, 4 to 5 years to a semi-dwarf crop. Buried tote cellar, 20-gallon tote, 1/4-inch holes near the top, damp sand, a foot of straw, $14 to $22, plus about $8 for the sand. And curing salt is not table salt. Get your cure numbers from your extension service and weigh them. That is the whole of it. Here is what I want you to do this week, and it is one thing, not 10. Go buy a cheap thermometer and put it in the coldest corner of wherever you live. The north closet, the stairwell, the back porch, the crawl space. Leave it a week and read it morning and evening. That is it. That 1 week of reading tells you which of the 4 climates you already own, and everything in this talk hangs on knowing that number. If it comes in under 50, buy a 5-pound bag of onions and a sack of keeper apples and try it. And if it comes in over 60, then you know your pantry is a fermenting pantry and not a storing one, and that is worth knowing too. And if you spent your working life at this trade, in produce, in cold storage, in a packing house or an orchard, I would be glad to hear what I got right and what I got only half right. This audience is full of people who know more than I do about one particular thing, and I would rather be corrected than admired. Amos has been out in the shop this week fixing the handle on the corn sheller, which broke in November, and which he has now been fixing for 11 weeks, and I mention that only so you know how things really go around here. The hens have started back up, 3 eggs on Tuesday, which is the first sign of spring anybody on this place will admit to. And for those of you watching from Australia, flip my calendar over. Your cellar season is coming in June. Now before you go, I want you to tell me something, and I read every single one of these. Half of my best talks started as somebody's memory down there in the comments. What did your grandmother keep, and where did she keep it? The crock on the porch. The bin under the stairs. The apples in the newspaper. The tin behind the flour. Tell me the place, not just the food, because the place is the part that got lost. And tell me what county you write from, because here is the thing I promised you at the start. You were going to recognize her pantry, and I think you do. Somewhere in your family, no further back than a grandmother, there was a woman who knew exactly where everything went in her house and why, and who could have fed 9 people on nothing in the last week of January, and she probably never once thought of that as a skill. She thought of it as keeping house. Nobody wrote it down because everybody knew it, and then one day nobody knew it. Your grandmother did not fail to hand it to you. The world just got fast and the old ways got quiet. That is nobody's sin, but it can be mended. And tonight, it is a little bit mended, because the map is back in your house where it belongs. Della Sargent lived to be old. She buried a husband and raised most of those 9 to grown in the same 2 rooms, and every one of them said the same thing when they were asked about it later, which was that their mother's table was the richest they ever sat at. She was not poor. She was fed, and she was beholden to no store. And there is a difference. And that difference is the whole reason I have talked at you this long. Next time I want to take you into the November hog killing and the 14 things that came off one animal, because everything in today's talk rests on that 1 week in the fall. The old folks in our church have a saying, take all you want, but eat all you take. A pantry is just that saying with a roof on it. The Lord bless you and keep you, and if we are spared and willing, I will see you at the next one. That is how the careful old folks did it. That is how it is still done in any farmhouse that remembers.